On the morning of September 1st, 1982, Agustin Legorreta Chauvet did not see it coming. Nobody did. He was watching television, the same television set that hundreds of millions of other Mexicans were watching that morning, when President José López Portillo appeared on screen, his voice cracking with what sounded like either grief or fury, and announced that every privately owned bank in Mexico was, effective immediately, nationalized, property of the state, gone. Legorreta owned the largest private bank in the country. He found out the same way a farmer in Oaxaca did. That is the story, not fraud, not recklessness, not a gamble gone wrong. A man built the finest financial institution in his country over 3 generations, ran it with rigor and discipline, grew it into a $900 million fortune, and then watched a single politician dissolve all of it in a 4-minute televised speech. The rules didn't bend. They were simply erased. To understand how that morning felt, you have to understand what Banamex was, not just as a bank, as an idea, as a piece of Mexico itself. The bank's full name was the Banco Nacional de Mexico, and it was founded in 1884 during the Porfiriato, the long authoritarian modernization project of Porfirio Diaz. From its earliest decades, Banamex was not simply a place to deposit money. It was the place, the institution that financed the country's railroad expansion, issued currency during periods when the Mexican state lacked the credibility to do so itself, and served as a kind of shadow central bank for the Republic. By the time Agustin Legorreta Chauvet inherited its stewardship, the bank was nearly a century old. It had survived revolution, depression, and multiple currency crises. It had outlasted presidents, generals, and financial panics that had swallowed lesser institutions whole. Agustin came from banking royalty in the most literal sense. His grandfather had been a founder of the institution. His father, Agustin Legorreta S.R., had served as its director for decades, steering it through the turbulent middle of the 20th century with the kind of patrician confidence that only comes from believing, in your bones, that the institution you lead is too important to fail. When Agustin Legorreta Chauvet took the helm, he was not a self-made man in the American mold. He was something arguably more powerful in Latin American terms, a dynastic inheritor who had been trained, groomed, and credentialed from birth to run exactly this thing. And he ran it well. By the late 1970s, Banamex had more branches than any other private bank in Mexico, more deposits, more employees, more reach into the Mexican economy than any competitor. It financed industry, agriculture, real estate, and government debt. Its balance sheet touched the lives of millions of Mexicans who had never heard the name Legorreta. The bank was the country's circulatory system, and Agustin Legorreta Chauvet was, by every reasonable measure, the man who kept it beating. His personal fortune at its peak, by some estimates approaching $900 million in the values of the time, reflected not just the bank's profitability, but its indispensability. You can't replicate that position. You can't disrupt it. It is woven into the economic fabric so completely that removing it would cause a national unraveling, or so anyone watching from the outside would have believed. What that wealth looked like in practice was the quiet opulence of the Mexican establishment elite, not the flashy excess that would define the next generation of Latin American wealth. The Legorreta family operated in a world of art collections and colonial architecture, of Club de Banqueros dinners and discreet influence over government policy. In the Mexico City of the late 1970s, there was a phrase that captured the social ceiling of a certain kind of ambition. You wanted to be someone the Legorreta family would take a meeting with. That was the summit. Agustin Legorreta Chauvet was not above the Mexican establishment. He was, in many respects, its clearest expression. But Mexico in those years was not the stable platform it appeared to be from a boardroom in Paseo de la Reforma. Beneath the surface, the country was running on borrowed time and borrowed money, enormous quantities of both. The 1970s had been an era of intoxicating optimism in Mexico, fueled by the discovery of vast offshore oil reserves. President López Portillo, who came to power in 1976, famously declared that Mexico's challenge was now to manage abundance. The country borrowed aggressively against its oil future, expanding social programs, building infrastructure, growing the state sector. Foreign banks, American, European, Japanese, lined up to lend to a petrostate with apparently limitless collateral beneath its seabed. By 1981, the picture had changed with brutal speed. Global oil prices collapsed. The dollar interest rate set by Paul Volcker's Federal Reserve climbed to nearly 20%, making Mexico's dollar-denominated debt, which by now stood somewhere around $80 billion, catastrophically expensive to service. Capital flight began quietly, then accelerated. Wealthy Mexicans and foreign investors alike started moving money out of pesos and into dollars, reading the signals the government refused to acknowledge publicly. Legorreta watched all of this from inside the system. As the head of Mexico's largest private bank, he had a clearer view of the capital flows and the balance of payments crisis than almost anyone outside the Treasury. There is evidence that in private meetings, he and other banking figures communicated alarm to the government about the peso's unsustainability. The government's response was to maintain the official exchange rate through increasingly artificial interventions. Here is the first sharp edge of the tragedy. The private banks, including Banamex, continued to operate within the rules as they existed. They were not reckless speculators. They were institutions doing what institutions do, working within the regulatory and monetary environment the government maintained. When the government told the banks the peso was stable, the banks could not simply refuse to believe them. Their depositors, their borrowers, their entire book of business was denominated in a currency the state controlled. In February 1982, the peso was finally devalued, sharply, traumatically, from roughly 26 to the dollar to nearly 70. The shock to the banking system was immediate and severe. Institutions that had made dollar-denominated loans suddenly found their borrowers unable to repay. Institutions that had taken dollar deposits found themselves holding peso assets that had lost half their value. The numbers in the banking system did not add up anymore, and everyone who understood balance sheets knew it. Through the spring and summer of 1982, Mexico lurched toward the moment that would define an era in international finance, the first major sovereign debt default of the modern globalized economy. On August 12th, the government announced it could not service its foreign debt. The peso had by then collapsed to over 100 to the dollar. Inflation was accelerating. The financial system was in crisis. And then came September 1st. López Portillo's speech that morning lasted about an hour in total, and it ranged across everything: the oil boom, the foreign banks he accused of bleeding Mexico dry, the speculators he blamed for the peso collapse, the betrayal he said he had suffered at the hands of international capital. But the sentence that mattered, the sentence that separated the world before from the world after, was the nationalization decree. All private banks in Mexico were now property of the federal government. Compensation would be paid in government bonds, valued at government-assessed prices, paid out over time. The timing, the terms, the valuation, none of it had been negotiated with the bank's owners. It was announced, not discussed. Legorreta, by multiple accounts, was not in the National Palace that morning. He was not in a back room where the decree had been shaped. He learned what had happened to his life's work and his family's century-long project from the same broadcast every other Mexican was watching. Think about what that means operationally for a moment. By the time the speech ended, Banamex was no longer Legorreta's bank. His employees reported to the state. His branches were state property. His board had no authority. The institution he had been stewardship over, that his father had stewarded and his grandfather had helped create, was nationalized with less ceremony than a zoning variance. You could not call a lawyer and file an injunction. You could not negotiate a price. The decree was the law, issued by a president with the constitutional authority to issue it, and it was done. The compensation offered was, by most analyses, a fraction of actual market value. The government set the terms, and the former owners had limited recourse. Legorreta's $900 million fortune, which existed primarily as ownership equity in Banamex and affiliated entities, was not so much lost as it was transmuted into government paper, revalued downward, and paid out over time in a currency that was itself depreciating rapidly. The practical effect: for a family that had held a controlling stake in a century-old banking institution was devastation. There were 88 private banks nationalized that day. Hundreds of families lost everything or nearly everything. But none carried the symbolic weight of Banamex, and none carried the particular anguish of the Legorreta name, a family whose identity was so completely fused with the institution that the two were, for most Mexicans, interchangeable. The human cost spread far beyond the Legorreta family. Thousands of Banamex employees found themselves working for a state institution run by government appointees with political considerations, not banking ones. Shareholders who had invested in private banks as a relatively stable, respectable store of value lost their stakes. The message sent to Mexican private capital was geological in its force: nothing is secure. If the state wants it, the state will take it legally, with a speech on morning television. The nationalization did not save Mexico's economy. The crisis of 1982 deepened into what Latin Americans call the lost decade: 10 years of stagnation, inflation, structural adjustment, and grinding poverty that affected the lives of ordinary Mexicans far more severely than any banker's loss. The peso continued to fall. Inflation peaked above 100% annually by 1987. Real wages collapsed. The medicine prescribed, privatization, liberalization, austerity, took years to implement and longer to bear any fruit. Banamex itself was eventually privatized again in 1991 under President Salinas de Gortari's sweeping privatization of state enterprises. The irony is exact and merciless. The bank was sold back to private investors 9 years after being taken, at prices that reflected a decade of state mismanagement. Legorreta did not reclaim it. A different banking group, led by Roberto Hernandez and Alfredo Harp Helú, acquired control. In 2001, Citigroup purchased Banamex for $12.5 billion, making it, at that moment, one of the largest acquisitions in Latin American banking history. The institution the Legorreta family had built over a century was worth $12.5 billion to an American bank in 2001. It had been nationalized in 1982 with bonds. Agustin Legorreta Chauvet did not disappear into obscurity. He remained a figure in Mexican financial and business circles in the years after the nationalization, working within the considerable but diminished space available to him. He died in 2003. The dynasty he represented, 3 generations of Legorreta men who had made Banamex their identity and their instrument, did not reconstitute itself in its original form. The bank had been the dynasty. Without it, the dynasty was simply a family name. What do you do with a story like this? There is no villain in the conventional sense. López Portillo was responding, poorly, recklessly, some economists would say disastrously, to a genuine national emergency. The foreign banks and speculators he raged against in his speech were behaving exactly as capital always behaves, moving toward safety and return. Legorreta had not stolen from anyone, had not gambled with depositors' money in ways that departed from the norms of his era, had not made the single catastrophic decision that defines most collapse stories. He ran his institution well, by most accounts, within the rules of the game as it existed. And then the rules were abolished, in real time, on television. That is the cruelest mechanism in this story, and the reason it sits differently from the stories of men who blew fortunes on bad bets or spectacular ego. Legorreta's collapse asks a harder question. It asks, what is wealth, really? Is it the number on a balance sheet, or is it the stability of the system that makes that number mean something? Is a $900 million fortune real if the government that backs the currency in which it is denominated can also, by presidential decree, determine that it no longer belongs to you? Every fortune exists within a political context. Every empire depends on the continued willingness of the state to enforce the rules under which it was built. Most of the time, that willingness holds, and we forget the arrangement exists. The Legorreta story is what happens when it doesn't, when you wake up on a Tuesday and learn, from the television, that the compact has been cancelled. The bank was built over 100 years. It was gone before lunch. Some losses can be traced to a single bad morning, a single leveraged bet, a single moment of overconfidence. This one was different. This one was just a man in a room, watching a screen, realizing that everything his family had made, everything he had spent his life running, had just become a line item in someone else's budget. No phone call, no negotiation, no warning. Just a decree, and then silence.